afternoon and welcome to CEC Gurukul lecture. In continuation with the series on Indian sociological tradition, I am going to continue with the important thinker, that is M.N Srinivas. In today's lecture, I am going to look specifically to how Srinivas conceptualizes or tries to make sense of the process of social change in post-independent India. But before I start into my today's lecture, just a brief kind of a recap in terms of understanding what is social change and how Srinivas goes about problematizing it. So we know that Srinivas is a structural functionalist whose intention was to offer us an understanding of Indian society. And when we look into the contribution that Srinivas has made to the sociology of India, 3 points are very important, critical, it is important to keep in mind. Number one, that he started writing at a time when there was already a body of text which was trying to visualize India in terms of a closed system of caste, where caste was seen as kind of creating no possibility of mobility, and in that context he gives us the process of upward mobility, which he termed as Sanskritization. Second, he makes us understand that as Indian sociologists, it is very important to use the method of social anthropology with his special focus on participant observation. Now again, to do a recap, this understanding or his focus on participant observation, which he calls as a field view and differentiates it from the book view, was the result of his training under Rattle Brown and Evans Pritchard. The third important contribution of M.N Srinivas is that he kind of wanted to start the study of India from the village, and that was done for two intentions. One, that village could give us an entry point to understand the nature of change taking place in India, and two, it could do away with the view that villages were isolated unit. So this was where he is trying to understand social change, and as I have already said in the earlier lecture, that social change is a process of transformation which takes place over a period of time. It is not spontaneous. So here, when we look into social change, in the last two lectures, we looked into Sanskritization, Westernization and secularization, which was predominantly the nature of change taking place in India in the colonial period. And today's lecture, the specific focus is to look into the nature of society in post-independent India. And it is here which is very critical that Srinivas begins his analysis by looking into the constitutional reforms which were made with the India gaining independence. And these constitutional reforms were made with an intention to bring about social economic equality in India. But for some reason or the other, which he is trying to put forward, there was certain negative side of it, and therefore he calls it as if he is living in a time of revolution. He calls it as a silent revolution. So by looking into the entire process of the constitution, the guarantee made by constitution, the entire process of nation building, and then he raises a very important question of how significant is democracy to India. We look through all of this to make a sense of how he tried to give us an understanding of the nature of social change in post-independent India. So we know that in post-independent India, that is 1947 onward, this is a passage from a colonial period to a kind of an independent idea of creating a nation and being independent. So it covers all a very long period, say from 1940s, say till the whole 1990s, and till he kind of was writing about Indian society. And if we try to understand, he was looking at the broader change which was taking place. So he says that India, when we look into from say 1940s to the 1990s, has moved gradually from a period of non-violent kind of a revolution to a period of very rapid and violent. So, and we are very aware of it. We see so much of violence all around us, and there are several factors for the emergence of these violence. So Srinivas has made sense of why these violences are kind of taking place or were taking place. And one thing to keep in mind while I give this lecture, that we are not doing a critical assessment of Srinivas. I am just trying to explain in the terms of how Srinivas has done the understanding of social change in post-independent India. So he was of opinion that with the adoption of constitution, a revolution started taking place, which and this revolution he will trace back to the ideals or to the certain facts, guarantees which the Constitution of India made. Now, keeping in mind that the Constitution was formulated keeping in mind the heterogeneity, the diversity, the inequality, and a large number. So, the entire idea of a socialist democratic country or building a nation which was so secular, socialist and democratic was the idea behind the making of the constitution. Srinivas points out to some of the problems that the constitution created. It raised kind of a questioning of the functioning of the parliamentary democracy. So, on one side, there were kind of a guarantee of equality, equity that wanted to safeguard the interest of a particular section of society, specifically the weaker section who had been denied certain rights and resources over a period of time. But once this guarantee was made, it all kind of questioned the other side. So, there was a way in which it did not actually work in the terms of the ideals or the vision of the constitution makers. So, Srinivas says that he was living in a times of silent revolution, which he termed as a living revolution, and this idea of what he thinks about a revolution is clearly written in his book, The Living in a Time of Revolution. So, he describes India as one of the most violent country of the time, and he is quite surprised that so much of violence is taking place, despite of the fact that India is a place which has given birth to the idea of ahimsa. We know Gandhiji's policy of non-violence, and at the same time India is also a place or a country which has given birth to the religion like Buddhism, in which there is the eightfold path or the path towards kind of peace, and in spite of that, so there is a coexistence of both violence and efforts made towards unity and peace. So, where does he locate this violence? He says that all over the place, that in India we see in the 50s and 60s there were instances of violence, and he kind of considers it as two sources of violence. One is endogenous. The endogenous is that it has a source within the country. It is kind of originating because of certain factor which is a part of the country itself, and endogenous source of changes are the rural and agrarian agitations, sons of soil movement, student agitation, dowry death. If you look into 50s, 60s, it is kind of a history of social movement in India. And the second movement that he is source of violence is exogenous, which has been coming due from outside or which is kind of funded from outside. And here he is looking into the militancy especially with reference to Sikh, Kashmir and Tamil militancy. So, what he is actually was, he was disturbed by the level of violence and conflict that was taking all around. So, if we look into the mapping, he says that with the passing of the constitution, this kind of a silent revolution started, and in the 50s to 70s, the cause was kind of the constitutional reforms or changes that were introduced, but 1917 onwards we see a large scale rapid socio-economic political transformation was taking place, and this kind of was the resources available to individuals were restricted, the takers for resources was very high. So, the competition and conflict over scarce resources increased, and therefore, it kind of the intensity of the revolution increases 1970 onwards. So, as I have already said, till 70s the nature of the violence revolution was non-violent. It was in terms of agitation, in terms of protest, but it would never take a form of kind of killing and taking blood. 1970 onward, it becomes violence. There's a lot of blood being all over the place. And the very important thing that Srinivas tells us, and that makes help to understand the nature of social change in contemporary India, is in terms of the symbol of the revolution. So earlier, where revolution is kind of symbolized by the gun, whereas he's talking about the revolution, he's talking about ballot box. And this ballot box comes in from the constitutional provision of adult franchisee, which gave the right to every individual above a certain age to cast their vote. So the ballot box becomes very significant. And here, when we look into the ballot box, he's also talking about the vote bank. So he is talking about how the ballot box or the vote bank can be a cause of conflict between, say, two different castes, between two different religions, between two different regions. So the symbol of the revolution post 1970 is a ballot box. And when we look into the stage, in terms of, it was just beginning, it was just starting in 1950s, 1970s onwards, it becomes a very progressive revolution. And it would not be incorrect to say that we are still in a certain part, or rather the nature or the intensity of violent revolution has certainly increased over this. So we look into the causes that Srinivas has explained, and here he is giving us the cause of the revolution in terms of three of the constitutional provision. Number one, as I've already said, is adult franchisee. Number two is obviously a very high rate of growth of population, and third is protective discrimination. So there's a lot of debates and discussions around protective discrimination and the question of reservation even in contemporary India. So Srinivas kind of looks into the whole idea of protective discrimination from the kind of a part of the caste system, and therefore he kind of considers it as causing a conflict, intercaste as well as intra-caste conflict, because of the provision of protective discrimination. So we know that the policy of protective discrimination was the policy of reservation, whereby a number of seats were reserved for the weaker section, or especially the scheduled caste, the scheduled tribe and OBC. But at some levels, say even 1950s onwards, these seats were kind of, the reservation of seats was kind of messed up with politics, and these measures have been used to mobilize vote bank, and therefore it becomes a cause of conflict. So when we, as I've already said, the third factor, which was the growth of population, is a time when the number of takers or the demand of a certain product becomes increases. So the population of India was growing at a very high rate, and there were a lot of measures by the government of India to control the population. But why was it required? Because it could have, it did create a conflict over access to resources. Now this conflict is not at an individual level, it is at a collective level. So it kind of leads to conflict between two different castes, two different regions, two different religions, and that's why it becomes problematic. So the protective discrimination has led to reversal of traditional caste system. This is what Srinivas says, that the protective discrimination has reversed the traditional caste system in the name of socialism. So he is critical of the idea of protecting certain seats for the weaker section of society, because he feels that it is against the principle of socialism. Those scheduled castes who have been able to reap the benefits of the reservation are envied by the higher caste, and sarcastically are referred as government Brahmins of the new Brahmin. That is why he is saying there is a kind of a reversal of the traditional caste order. So these reservations policy kind of benefited certain section within the society. It was not that every member or the entire scheduled caste community were able to benefit. Only a particular section of the society benefited, and because of the benefit, they were able to move up the ladder, that is economically become progressive, and so they were up the ladder where Brahmins were supposed to wait. That is why he is calling it as the reversal of traditional caste system. Another problem that he raises for protective discrimination is that he considers backwardness as a relative phenomena, both between caste and with each caste category, and therefore he kind of it is problematic in the sense that he wants to tell us that this concept of backwardness is very ambiguous. The identifying which community is actually backward is problematic, and that it then becomes in order to ensure egalitarianism or in equity, the question of considering a criteria for allocating certain resources becomes problematic. Two factors that has led to the debacle of the policy of protective discrimination, that is, the policy has not kind of achieved the vision for which it was enshrined in the constitution. Srinivas is giving us two very important reason for it. One is the prevalence of high rate of corruption in getting caste certificate. As citizens of India, as students, we are much aware of the fact that corruption is part of everyday life, and therefore to get a caste certificate or to get a say any OBC certificate is not very difficult, and there have been n number of cases which has come out because of individuals or people taking a fake certificate just for the sake of getting a seat in an educational institution or getting a government employment. So that actually then is the problem of the implementation, that the policy in itself is okay, is kind of not problematic, but the way in which it has been implemented has kind of created certain problem. One problem is that not every section who were the actual beneficiary has received the benefit. Number two, it could be people, say, could be those who were politically powerful, those who were economically landed people, landed jamindar, and they were already in political power, could have misused the politics and economic power to get fake certificates or kind of get identity in the name, and therefore it becomes problematic. So there is a conflict at the level of backwardness, and it's also a part of a very contemporary event that large number of society also, or community rather, there has been a clash in order to kind of retain the category. So every community would now want to be identified as an OBC because that label will give you certain benefits. So the labeling is problematic. So the actual beneficiaries is not whether those who are from the SC, ST, OBC are the beneficiary, are getting the protective discrimination, but the way in which the label of backwardness has been misused is problematic. So basically, when he tries to look into the constitutional provision of protective discrimination and adult franchisee, he kinds of thinks that there were certain ways in which did not work properly, and therefore he tries to kind of make sense of the features of contemporary society. What could be the nature of the society? And obviously we need to remember that M.N Srinivas, he starts off with the caste system. So he kind of continues by looking into caste system as the reference point for understanding society. So one of the major concern that Srinivas was raising was with secularization, with constitutional provision, with protective discrimination, is the caste or is caste system kind of significant, or has it kind of eroded? And Srinivas would take a stand that even in contemporary India, caste based identity has kind of coupled up with other collective identity. So you have multiple identity which individuals have kind of used it to counteract other people. So there has been a sharpening of collective identities. Individuals in the contemporary society are more conscious about their identities as caste, sect, religion and region. And this identity has become, why has it become conscious? Why are we so aware of our identity? Because it is through the identity that access to resource will be determined. So if identity is labeled as say certain category, then it becomes an easy to take access. So if a particular community is able to take the labeling of OBC, then access to certain educational institution or government offices becomes very easy. And that is what Srinivas says, that there has been an increased sharpening of consciousness among individual. And this is not only kind of caste based identity, it is coupled, or it is a multiple identity becomes very important. So access to resource depends on numerical strength of a caste. Now here he brings in again the dominant caste. So the dominant caste, it was a caste which was more in number. So if the number of the caste in a particular village or a region is numerically high, it implies that it will be able to kind of have control over the ballot box. So the vote, they become the vote bank. So the caste identity gets sharpened because of politics. So there is a kind of a nexus between caste and politics which becomes problematic, and it is this nexus that determines access to wealth, education and political influence. Now it does not kind of end with the access itself. Now one group is not satisfied, as even if they have been able to take the benefit, they want more and more. This kind of the attitude to demand more and more access to resource to one particular community or caste leads to intercaste conflict, and therefore in contemporary India, Srinivas is saying that intercaste conflicts have become vicious and divisive. It's dividing the nation rather than building a united nation. It's kind of divided into segments and categories. So caste and other group affiliation for politics has become very evident, and it's we are all aware of the nature of the general elections that takes place in the country, that caste has become one of the determining factor of winning elections. And later on, say from 1980s onwards, caste combined with religion. So he will be talking about the whole idea of how religion and politics has become kind of an idea which divides the nation. So Srinivas argues that in order to emerge as a single political entity, so the vision of the constitution maker was to ensure that after the struggle, after a long period of struggle with colonial rule, India would emerge as a political entity and do away with the caste differences, do away with the regional diversity. Yet it failed to emerge as a political entity because of the sharpening of collective identities, and the two important thing was in terms of caste becoming more a divisive factor rather than just a system of occupational allocation of roles. Srinivas stresses that caste continued to play an increasingly important role in the political and economic life of modern India. Now, he was giving a lecture in the anthropological and archaeological seminar, where he was talking about the idea that caste is a very important factor in contemporary India. Now, his view that caste is relevant was rejected by a large number of other scholars and academicians, and the reason why it was rejected was of the idea that on one side there was a body theory which was saying that since there is a process of modernization, globalization, so caste based society would evolve into a class based society, and since untouchability was abolished and caste was no longer a system of occupational allocation, therefore the caste would kind of do away. But then in the 1957 general election, where we see that caste becomes a very important criteria for the winning election, and when he tries to make sense of the understanding of significance of caste of India, he talks about the Mandal and the Mandir controversy. The Mandal is the Mandal Commission which kind of reserved seats for SC, ST, OBC, and with the coming in of the Mandal Commission report in the 1990s, it led to an unrest between the upper caste and the lower caste, and therefore it became an important question on which the political parties were making the differences. And Mandir is the Ayodhya the idea of whether a mosque has to be built or a mandir has to be built, and it has continued. Even today we know how difficult the problem of it is. So even when we look into all the general election or what it was happening and how OBC labeling has been done, we know that both caste and religion has become decisive factor in winning political power, and the consciousness kind of has led to fragmentation. He kind of points out several reasons why protective discrimination has failed and how it kind have to be revised. So this, with this understanding of kind of is making sense of what were the ways in which the policies were not implemented in the right manner, how religion and caste got enmeshed with politics, and therefore the nature of social change in the post-independent India is a period which is marked with violence and kind of difficult for in terms of increased consciousness of collective identities. Thank you.